I thought I might write a book this year. Something to do, isn't it? One of those stupid New Year's resolutions that we all take. Yes, I'll write a book. Maybe it would be a science fiction book, something complete fantasy, could never happen, would never happen, surely. A bit like this one, actually. I don't know if you've ever read this, The Camp of the Saints, written in 1973. Fascinating story. Of course, couldn't happen, never would happen. But I just thought I'd share with you what the author said about how he approached the idea of his book. He said, I wrote The Camp of the Saints 10 years ago. I was not, am not a sociologist, and I'm not a futurologist. I'm simply a novelist who one morning in 1972, at home by the shores of the Mediterranean, had a vision. There they were. 1,000,000 poor wretches, armed with only their weakness and their numbers, overwhelmed by misery, encumbered with starving brown and black children, ready to disembark on our soil. The vanguard of the multitudes pressing hard against every part of the tired and overfed West. I literally saw the major problem that they presented. A problem absolutely insoluble by our present moral standards. To let them in would destroy us. To reject them would destroy them. Yes, it's the story, fascinating story of one day in France, a hulking great ship, a big ocean liner turns up and several others with it, with 1,000,000 people from the poorer side of the world, down in Africa and India. Those people, and of course back in those days they were all starving and they were in dire needs. And he said, well, what would happen if they all came at once in one go? 1,000,000 of them just came onto the soil and said, hello, here we are. They've got no arms, as in guns and things. It's just them and their children. Mass migration in one swell swoop. What would they do? And then that would be just the beginning, because there would be millions more on their way in these ships, in these great big ocean liners. And the story goes on to say what they would have to do. And it's rather bleak. In fact, I actually stopped reading it halfway through because I found it too distressing. But of course, that sort of thing would never happen. They couldn't get on a big, hulking, massive ship like that and just come over. I mean, if they came in dribs and drabs in little boats, I suppose you could, over a period of 10 to 20 years and then ramping it up, that could happen. But it's very unlikely, isn't it? So my book, I thought, could be along a similar vein, only not about that issue so much, although I guess that would be part of it in the long run. I was thinking, no, let's say that you took a bunch of megalomaniacs, people with a lot of money who think they're cleverer than everybody else. You know, a sort of James Bond type villain, but instead of one, there would be a group of them, maybe a club based in Rome or somewhere else. Maybe they have meetings at a place called, I don't know, it could be anywhere, couldn't it? Like Davos or somewhere. And that they've agreed within and among themselves that what they want to do is they want to get rid of a number of people in the world because they think there's too many people in it. I thought that would be quite an interesting subject for a book, complete fiction, of course, because it could never happen naturally. I mean, it would be silly to think that this could even happen, because how would they do it? Let's say they wanted to take away a large number of the population. I don't know where we are now, 7 or 8 billion, and yeah, they would just reduce it down to, let's think of an arbitrary figure that they might want to feel happy having around them. 500 million, maybe, something like that. That could be a good figure, couldn't it? Yeah, so they want to do that. But you think, well, how the hell could they do that? And they have a number of strategies. I've thought of these for my book. Completely original idea, you understand. So please don't nick the idea. So I would have maybe part of the strategy. This had been going on for some while, but part of the strategy could be, what they would do is take advantage of, I don't know, some natural virus, or it could be a man-made virus that escapes. In the 1970s, there was a television series, if I remember rightly, called Survivors. on the BBC. It was a horrific series, and yeah, it gave me the idea about this. This virus sort of escapes into the atmosphere and crosses across the world, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. But in my story, what I would do is these megalomaniacs, they've got the cure. They've got this magic juice. It's something that has to be injected into you. So they would call it something like I don't know, what would you call it? An antidote. We'll just use that word for the moment. It would be an antidote to this horrible virus, and it could get rid of it and stop people from ever catching it, and life would be all right. Only the antidote is rushed out very quickly without proper testing, so that would also add a little bit of controversy to the thing, and some people are a bit nervous about it. But don't worry, because it's very mild. You take one of these antidotes, these jabs, and then a few months later you take another one, and then actually, if that hasn't sort of worked, you try and encourage people to boost it up a bit with a few more. That would be one way. And of course, what these megalomaniacs haven't actually revealed is within this antidote is perhaps a nasty something which actually affects and makes the body, let's say, self-combust, just for the sake of argument, that people, after a while, they just blow up in some fashion, and that's it. And so that would be one strategy, that over, I don't know, 2 to 5, maybe 10 years, people are finding that they're dying early, or that the parents can't have children, or that the children are being stillborn, or things like that. I mean, completely spurious and completely unlikely ever to happen. Of course, that would be one thing that would be in it. But they would have other strategies, these megalomaniacs, because they're ever so clever. They've thought this through. So one thing is they would have come up with this, again, another long-term thing. They would frighten the world. They would scare the world that something's happening to the globe that they live on, this one thing. And it could be all sorts of things. Maybe the planet is, I don't know, getting too big. Maybe it's expanding, or maybe it's shrinking, or maybe it's getting too cold, or possibly warming up. It wouldn't really matter. They would come up with something, and then maybe there's, I don't know, an inert gas in there of some description that really is as harmless as anything, and in fact probably is a gas that's actually vital for life. That would be even better if you could find a gas that was vital for life, that helped things like trees grow and plants grow, but you somehow demonized it to make out that actually it was quite bad, and that in this process of the planet doing whatever it's doing, growing or shrinking, or getting colder, or possibly getting warmer, that actually it's man's fault. It's all man's fault, this process, because they drive around in cars would be a good thing, or they have a factory or something, or they're using a different type of fuel which is a bit dirty, and yes, wouldn't that be nice to get rid of that, because that's causing this, whatever this gas could be. I'll have to think on this, work on this a little bit harder for this complete work of fiction that I'm coming up with. And then the scientists would sort of turn around, because people wouldn't believe them unless they could make it a bit more scary. So this gas, they would say, let's say this gas was actually quite minor in the atmosphere. Let's say, I don't know, it was about 0.04% of it. But if you didn't describe it that way, if you described it as actually a different way, but still being truthful, say 415 parts per million of it. Now that sounds a bit scary. 415 parts per million of this gas, which is, pretty much a trace gas, really. But actually, when you say it like that, oh my God! And then you say that man, in the way that he's had the industries going on, has actually contributed to do this, has made it worse, because you hide the fact that there were periods in time that this gas was far, far higher, 6,000 parts per million, let's say, or 6% of the atmosphere. And actually that was really good for the plants and the trees, because they grew proficiently and gave us the wonderful green glow. But you'd hide that bit and make that obscure. So you've got that. So you've got this horrible thing that man's doing. And so what you would do, these megalomaniacs, let's think, what could they do? They could they scare everybody because they've got the power of money and fear and the mainstream media and the governments, and they're pulling all the strings, so they could persuade the population that this is a terrible thing. So what they need is another energy source to, because they can't burn all this other stuff that has actually got them out of poverty and enabled them to procreate, because that's the thing, they don't want them to procreate, do they? So what they do, of course, is they give them an alternative. No, this is great because it's, what could you call it? It's clean. It's green. Yes, it's green, and it'll reduce this terrible gas, which of course we won't tell the people that actually that's the key for life. No, we won't tell them that, but we'll actually reduce the this inert gas that's pretty harmless and actually good for us even lower. Will give us this energy source, which in actual fact sounds brilliant, but couldn't really in realistic terms provide the energy that the world would need. But that won't matter, because in actual fact most of those people of course won't be there, because they won't be able to pay their bills, and in the winter many of the old and frail and infirm wouldn't be able to afford any heating, so they'll all freeze to death. So that's another strategy to get rid of some of these people down to that magic number that my elites in my book, in my completely fictitious book, would be aiming for. Another thing they could do, of course, is because they would have so much influence and they're everywhere, they would control money. And using where we've come to now with the digital world, where it was been awkward in the old analog world, where people had cash and people were using the post office to send letters and everything took time. Now that everything's instant and is basically ones and zeros, and we can get everybody swamped into watching screens and being entertained by absolute drivel. We could have platforms in which people just sit there on these slabs. We'll make these electronic slabs, which are basically glass with a little bit of something underneath that you can't see how it works. And you just scroll endlessly, being amused by, and you'll allow other people to make the content, so it seems democratic. And then people will, I don't know, there'll be people who are just dancing about, they'll have cats, and they'll have all sorts of stupid, puerile, absolute nonsense that people will be transfixed by, so that they're not paying attention to actually what's going on. Because the megalomaniacs will be very clever. They will tell you, they'll put all the sources out there so everybody knows what's going on. It's not that they're lying. They'll tell you that they're going to take everything that you have, and of course you'll be very happy. This is what my megalomaniacs in my story, in my complete and utter fiction. So please don't nick the idea. I know it's growing. I'm developing the theme. But anyway, these megalomaniacs, of course, because everything's digital, you'd no need for cash. And in fact, they could say, look, what we need, because of this terrible event that's happening with the planet growing or shrinking or getting cold or perhaps getting warm, whatever it is, and we've got to get rid of this gas that's terrible stuff, we need to have some control on the money. So wouldn't it be great if everybody all just had the same digital currency and we controlled it from our bank? And if you were, I don't know, burning too many fires or taking too many journeys in your car, or you'd bought too much food, then of course we could would tax you or prevent you from accessing the money that you've made, because it wouldn't be real money. It would just be more a credit number, a credit score that we, the megalomaniacs, could well, we'd have the power to prevent you from doing that. And of course that would be a way of slowly penalising people, and some of them would naturally get so depressed they'd probably just top themselves. So that's another method. But if that didn't work, why not just reduce the amount of farming going on in the world? Instead of allowing people to farm and grow healthy food, these megalomaniacs would start shutting the farms down, perhaps buying up huge swathes of land and not letting anybody use it. And then instead of actually saying, we'll give you nice healthy food, we'll process stuff and call it healthy, and maybe then present you with this, we'll see how far we could go. Those things, I remember there was a scene in the film Papillon. Do you remember Papillon, that big motion picture film, I think, with Steve McQueen? And there he is on the island, and he's starving, and he's in this cell, and there's a creepy crawly, a bug, and he manages to crush it, and then he eats that. Yeah, we could let people eat bugs. That would be hilarious. These megalomaniacs, they could laugh their socks off. Of course, they'd have their own farms because there'd be plenty of land for them. And basically, over a period of, I don't know, 10, 20 years, this population would slowly reduce and reduce and reduce, and then you'd have only this 500 million people. It would be great. So, I mean, obviously it would never happen, because in real life, even if you had these megalomaniacs pulling the strings and trying to do that, in real life, the public, they're not thick, are they? They're not stupid. They wouldn't bury their heads in the sand. They wouldn't just carry on and ignore all this stuff in plain sight. Surely there would be uprisings in the street. They would unvote the government that they've got. They would put in a government that they would prefer. They would be doing something. There would be groups and huge protests. In fact, they would probably, in real life, they would do something about the megalomaniacs and make sure the megalomaniacs weren't around in the next 10 or 20 years. That's what I would imagine would happen in real life. But in my scenario, which is completely made up and not a thing, by the way, these megalomaniacs seem to get away with it. It's quite amazing, isn't it? In fact, I might nick a line or a thought from H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, in his War of the Worlds book, he had this concept that once the Martians had landed in their cylinders and they had started to unscrew, there's a line that he says, and now I'm going to paraphrase this because I can't remember it exactly. He says that looking back to the events that had happened, he found it remarkable that everybody carried on after the Martians had landed, and the threat that was coming from them, and they'd had the death ray come and kill a few people. Everybody carried on as if there was nothing to worry about, as if it was an ordinary day. Shopkeepers opened their shops and horse and carriages went about their business. And it's interesting because in that book, The War of the Worlds, there wasn't really any panic or any fear until the death ray started coming after them and the Martians were on their tripods. So maybe my megalomaniacs need to see a little bit of resistance in there. But of course, as I say, this wouldn't happen in the real world because people aren't stupid, are they? It's not like they would go and just let it happen, would they?